The heat of a savannah afternoon clung to the skin like wet cloth, and the smell of salt from the nearby wharf mixed with the sharp sting of tobacco and sweat. Flies buzzed around the auction block, landing on open mouths and sweating faces, but no one dared to flinch. Buyers leaned on canes, shaded by wide hats, murmuring bids over the voices of crying women. The auctioneer's bell clanged. "Next up, we got this old gal here," he barked, his voice dry as old parchment. "Name's Rose, says she been cooking 30 years, ain't got much strength left, but a loyal sort. We'll start at—" The crowd laughed before he could finish. 30 years. Look at her, she's half dead already. One trader jeered. The laughter rolled through the heat like thunder. Rose stood motionless. Her back was slightly bent, her skin a tapestry of lines, her eyes deep and still. She clutched a ragged kerchief in her hand, the last thing she owned. She'd been through too many auctions to cry anymore. Then a young man's voice rose from the back. Calm. Clear. $300. The laughter died. Heads turned. A gentleman in a clean linen coat, no more than 25, stepped forward. His name was Thomas Whitfield, though most called him Tommy, son of the late Henry Whitfield, owner of the Whitfield plantation along the Ogeechee River. The auctioneer blinked. 300? For her? Tommy's jaw set. 300. Cash. The gavel struck wood. Sold. As the crowd broke into murmurs, Rose lifted her head for the first time. Her eyes met his, uncertain. She saw no cruelty there, only something quiet, almost mournful. When the clerk brought the bill of sale, Tommy didn't haggle, didn't gloat. He handed over the notes, then took Rose's elbow gently. "Come," he said. "You're going home now." Home, the word stung her ears. Home had always meant a field, a shackle, a night too short to rest. Yet the young master's hand was steady, his grip respectful. As they stepped out of the market, men called after him, "Whitfield's gone soft. Buying charity cases now, eh? Won't last a week, she'll die before harvest." Tommy said nothing. He helped Rose onto the wagon, unbothered by the stares. His driver, a tall freedman named Caleb, cracked the reins. The horses moved slow through the muddy street, past shops and taverns, past faces twisted in disbelief. Rose watched the city fade behind them. "Why you do this, Master Whitfield?" she asked finally, her voice gravelly from years of smoke and silence. He looked ahead, not at her. "Because once, you fed me when no one else would. My father whipped you for it. I never forgot." Her breath caught. A memory small and buried stirred, a little boy hiding in the smokehouse, trembling after a beating, the cook sneaking him bread in her apron folds. That boy had grown into this man. She looked at him again. "That was long time ago," he nodded. "Too long." The wagon rattled over the stones, the sun sinking red behind the moss-draped oaks. Rose's hands trembled as she gripped the wooden sideboard. "You paid good money for me," she said softly, "but I ain't worth that anymore." Tommy smiled faintly. "Worth has nothing to do with work." She didn't understand. Not yet. As they neared the Whitfield plantation, the air grew quiet except for the cicadas. The white columns of the main house gleamed through the trees like a ghost from the past. Every shutter and post reminded Rose of a life she thought long gone, the kitchen fires, the lashings, the prayers whispered into rags, so the masters wouldn't hear. A few slaves came running from the fields, their hoes still in hand. They froze when they saw who was with the young master. Whispers darted between them like sparrows. "That's her," one said. "Rose Washington. Thought she was dead." Tommy helped her down, from the wagon. "You'll stay in the old cookhouse," he said gently. "No work until you've rested. Caleb will bring your supper." Rose hesitated at the threshold. "Master Henry used to keep the dogs here," she said quietly. "I know," Tommy answered. "That's why it's yours now, so they'll never be chained here again." The words hit her like thunder. She stepped inside, the air cool and dusty. On the hearth lay a single fresh blanket and a small oil lamp. The faint scent of lavender drifted from it, something gentle, something human. Outside, the night deepened. Tommy walked back toward the big house, the sound of crickets thick in the air. From the balcony above, Samuel the overseer watched him, face hard. "Bought yourself a fine relic," he muttered. "Boy's gonna ruin everything his daddy built." But Tommy didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt peace. Back in the cookhouse, Rose sat by the lamp, the light trembling on her face. She whispered to herself, her voice barely a breath, Maybe this time the Lord done remembered me. And outside, under the ancient oaks, the wind carried her words away into a night that was about to change everything. The morning mist clung to the fields like a veil, and the first light of dawn spread over Whitfield Farm in soft gold. Rose sat in the wagon as it rolled down the long dirt road lined with pecan trees, the branches stretching like arms heavy with memory. The plantation had not changed since the last time she saw it. Same white-pillared mansion, same brick quarters by the river, same smell of earth and sweat and sorrow. She thought she'd never see this place again, but here she was, back where her life had nearly ended 100 times. Tommy walked beside the wagon, his coat thrown over his shoulder, his hair damp with dew. He paused often to greet the field workers, freeborn laborers now, though many still called him master. Old habits clung to them like the dust. When the wagon stopped before the kitchen yard, Rose gripped the sideboard, unsure whether to step down. The last time she'd stood here, she'd been dragged by her hair for spilling soup, her knees locked with old terror. Tommy saw it. He extended his hand. "You're safe here, Miss Rose," he said softly. She stared at that hand, strong, clean, unthreatening, and took it. Her fingers were cracked and twisted, but his clasp was steady. He led her to a small cottage just beyond the garden. It had been the gardener's quarters once, now repaired with new shingles and whitewashed walls. The door opened with a squeak, revealing a tidy space. Bed neatly made, a wooden chest, a pitcher of water, and a folded shawl on the chair. Rose blinked at the sight. "You fixed all this?" Tommy nodded. "Caleb and I didn't want you living in that cookhouse another night." She ran her hand along the bedpost. "Ain't nobody fixed me a place in 30 years. He smiled faintly. "Then it's about time someone did." For a moment, silence filled the room. The air was thick with unspoken history. Outside, Caleb called, "Mr. Whitfield, the workers be waiting for you in the north field." Tommy nodded, tipping his hat. "I'll see you at supper, Miss Rose. Rest easy today." When he left, Rose sat on the bed, her body trembling with confusion. This kindness, it was something she didn't trust. Men in fine coats had smiled at her before. Their smiles always hid cruelty. But this one felt different. She looked through the open window. The fields stretched far and wide, glistening with dew. Dozens of workers bent over rows of cotton, but their laughter was strange. It sounded lighter than she remembered. No overseer's whip cracked in the distance, no screaming, only the creak of the plow and the rhythm of songs carried on the wind. By mid-morning, she gathered the courage to step outside. A young woman, carrying a bucket of feed, stopped and gasped. "Mama Rose! Lord, it is you!" Rose turned. The girl's face stirred, an old memory, round cheeks, wide eyes. "Ain't you little Dinah?" Dinah laughed through tears and dropped the bucket to hug her. "I was just a child when they sold you away. Folks said you was gone for good." Rose's voice cracked. "I thought the same." Dinah held her hands. "He done changed this place, Mama Rose. You won't believe it. No whips, no chains. We got wages now. Every man and woman got a say. Mr. Tommy, he different." Rose studied her. "And they let him do all that?" Dinah nodded. "Some folks don't like it. But he don't bend. Says freedom's the only way we live, right in God's eyes." Rose's lips trembled. "Your master talking like a preacher now." "Maybe so," Dinah grinned. "But he mean every word." They walked together toward the garden. Children ran past with baskets of sweet potatoes, laughing. 2 older men hammered planks for a new chicken coop. The air felt alive, not the heavy, suffocating air of bondage, but something open and uncertain like spring after a long winter. By noon, Rose found herself helping in the kitchen again. Her hands remembered the motions, kneading dough, stirring stew, adding spices by touch. The younger cooks watched her with awe. "She moves like she never left," one whispered. But Rose didn't boast. "I done this all my life," she said simply. "Only difference now, I ain't doing it in chains." That evening, Tommy returned from the fields, dirt on his sleeves and sunlight on his face. He sat on the porch steps while Rose poured him a cup of coffee. You work too hard, she scolded gently. That ain't for gentlemen. He smiled. Maybe not for gentlemen, but it's for men who want to build something right. She nodded, studying him. You remind me of your mama. She had that same fire. Tommy's eyes softened. She was the reason I bought you, Rose. She told me once you saved her baby from fever. That baby was me. Rose went still. She remembered that? Every day. The air grew still between them. Fireflies blinked in the twilight, the sound of frogs croaking from the riverbank. Rose stared at the sky, her voice low. I prayed every night for the Lord to take me. Never thought I'd live to see a day like this. Tommy looked at her with quiet conviction. You'll see many more. I mean for this place to become a home, not a prison. Rose shook her head slowly. Home, she whispered. That word used to hurt, but maybe it don't anymore. As night fell, lanterns glowed across the quarters, laughter floating like music through the trees. Rose stood at her window, the scent of warm bread filling the room. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel owned. She felt seen. And though the world outside still clung to chains and cruelty, in this small corner of Georgia, a miracle was beginning to breathe. The days at Whitfield Farm began to move like the steady rhythm of a hymn familiar, gentle but carrying an undercurrent of something revolutionary. Rose felt it in the air every morning as the sun broke over the cotton rows and the church bell from the nearby settlement chimed across the hills. The old order of things had started to tremble, though few dared name it aloud. She rose early each dawn, her body creaking like an old door, but her spirit restless with purpose. The kitchen had become her sanctuary again. Children ran in and out for biscuits, men brought harvest sacks for weighing, and laughter replaced the heavy silence that used to rule the quarters. But under it all, a whisper was spreading from the cabins to the fields, from worker to worker. The master's fixing to free us all, someone murmured by the well. He's signing papers soon, they say, another added, glancing over his shoulder. Don't speak so loud, came a warning. The overseer got ears everywhere. Rose heard them all. She carried those whispers in her heart like fragile seeds. One evening, she found Tommy in the small study beside the main hall. The young master sat at his father's old desk, surrounded by ledgers and law books. A single candle flickered beside a quill dipped in ink. The room smelled of parchment and pipe smoke. You working too late again, Rose said, stepping softly through the doorway. He looked up, smiling faintly. I can't help it. The lawyers in Savannah keep sending letters. They say manumission will ruin me. Maybe it will, she said simply, folding her arms. But ruin can be holy if it sets folks free. He paused, considering that. You believe it can really work, Rose? A farm run by free hands? She nodded slowly. I seen enough to know bondage don't grow nothing but hate. You want good harvest, you plant in love. Tommy leaned back, a shadow of doubt still in his eyes. The men in town say I'm mad. They say my father would turn in his grave. Rose's voice softened. Your daddy ruled this land with fear. You got the chance to rule it with mercy. Ain't no shame in that. Outside, a thunderstorm rolled across the horizon. Rain began to fall in soft sheets, pattering on the tin roof. The sound filled the silence between them. Tell me something, Miss Rose, he said after a while. What kept you alive through all of it? The beatings, the separations, the years? She thought for a long time. Hope, she said finally. Even when it hurt, hopes like them, weeds in the field, don't matter how many times they cut it, it come back. Tommy smiled at that, setting his pen aside. Then I suppose we'll let hope grow wild here. The next morning, word of the conversation began to ripple through the quarters. Rose didn't spread it, but the younger ones had ways of hearing everything. By sunset, the talk of freedom was louder than the chirp of crickets. But not everyone was pleased. Samuel, the overseer, watched from afar with narrowed eyes. His face was leathered by years in the sun, his heart hardened by a lifetime of control. He'd served under Tommy's father and knew only one kind of order, the kind kept by the whip. He cornered Caleb by the stables that night. You been with him long enough to know better, he growled. You tell your young master this foolish talk of freedom will ruin us all. Ain't no man works without a chain in his mind. Caleb straightened, taller and calmer than the overseer liked. "He ain't asking nobody to chain their mind no more," he said quietly. Samuel's eyes flashed. "You keep your tongue in your mouth, boy. When this place falls, you'll be begging me for scraps." But Caleb didn't flinch. "Then I reckon I'll starve free." The overseer turned away, muttering curses into the dark. Back in her cottage, Rose prayed long into the night. She felt the storm brewing, not the kind that split trees, but the kind that split hearts. She knew freedom wouldn't come easy. Every change worth having came with a cost. A few days later, she gathered the women in the old smokehouse for evening prayers. Candles flickered in their hands as she spoke softly. "Don't let your joy turn to fear," she told them. "If the Lord opened the door, don't be scared to walk through," a young man asked. "And if the master change his mind," Rose shook her head. "The truth don't go backward. Once it's out forever." Her words settled over them like a blessing. By the week's end, even the neighboring plantations were buzzing. At the church in town, Reverend Cartwright thundered from the pulpit about the Whitfield heresy, calling Tommy's compassion an affront to divine order. But Tommy didn't stop attending service. He sat in the back pew, hat in hand, calm as ever. Rose watched from across the aisle, pride swelling quietly in her chest. She had seen men beaten into cruelty, broken into silence, but never one who fought with kindness. That night, as fireflies danced over the fields, she stood by the garden, her hands buried in the soil. Tommy joined her there. "You ever wonder," he said softly, "what heaven looks like?" Rose chuckled. "Maybe it looks something like this. Folks working side by side. No one's better than the other." He nodded slowly, gazing over the moonlit fields. "Then we'll build a little bit of heaven here, Rose, even if the world calls it madness." She looked up at him, the faint smile on her weathered face glowing in the pale light. "Madness done built this land. Maybe it's time mercy did too." And as the night deepened around them, the first fragile seeds of freedom whispered in kitchens, prayed over in cabins, and carried by the wind began to root in Georgia soil. The morning broke cool and still, as if the world itself held its breath. A soft fog lay across the cotton rows, turning every leaf silver. From her doorway, Rose felt the quiet before revelation, the kind of quiet that came when heaven was listening. Tommy had barely slept. He'd spent half the night hunched over his desk, pen scratching against parchment, drafting the documents that would unshackle every soul on his land. When dawn touched the window, he gathered the pages, sealed them with wax, and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him, "Let mercy be the law." By sunrise, word spread through the quarters that the master was calling everyone to the main yard. Men left their plows standing, women wiped flour from their hands. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, sensing something big. Rose stood near the old oak tree as Tommy stepped onto the porch, papers trembling slightly in his grasp. Beside him stood Caleb, solemn and tall, a witness to history. The overseer, Samuel, lingered on the edge of the crowd, jaw clenched tight. Tommy took a deep breath. "Friends," he began. The word itself made a few gasp. "I've asked you here today because I can no longer pretend that what we've been doing is right. My father believed this land was built on ownership. I believe it must now be built on freedom." A murmur swept the yard, disbelief, fear, wonder. He held up the documents. "These are deeds of manumission, legal papers freeing every man, woman, and child who has worked this soil. As of this moment, you belong to no man but God." No one moved. The words hung in the air like lightning before thunder. Then one woman fell to her knees, sobbing. Another shouted, "Praise be." A chorus of voices rose, half crying, half singing. Rose covered her mouth, tears burning her eyes. She had dreamed of this day, but never dared believe it would come from a master's hand. Samuel stepped forward, face red with fury. "You can't do this, boy," he barked. "You'll ruin the estate. You'll be the laughingstock of the county." Tommy faced him calmly. "Then let them laugh. I won't build my life on another's suffering. You're throwing away generations of wealth." Tommy's eyes hardened. "Maybe we should have thrown it away generations ago." The overseer's fists curled, but Caleb stepped between them. "Ain't no need for fighting today," he said evenly. "This day's holy." Samuel spat in the dirt and stormed off toward the stables, muttering curses that no one cared to hear. Tommy turned back to the crowd. There will be changes, he continued. If you wish to stay, you'll work for wages, real wages. If you wish to go, you'll have my blessing and enough money to start anew. This farm will belong to those who keep it alive. A hush fell again, deeper now. Freedom, so long prayed for, suddenly felt too big to grasp. Rose stepped forward slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "Mr. Tommy," she said, her voice trembling, "I seen the sun rise on 1,000 days of bondage. Never thought I'd see it rise on freedom." He bowed his head to her. "You taught me what kindness looks like, Rose. I'm only returning what you already gave." The people began to gather around her, looking to her as they always had. She lifted her hands, voice strong despite the quiver. "You heard him, we free. But freedom ain't just a word, it's a work. We got to keep it, tend it, like the Lord's garden. Don't let no fear steal it from you." Cheers burst through the yard, deep, raw, unstoppable. Drums beat from the quarters. Women danced barefoot in the dust. For the first time, laughter rolled across Whitfield Farm without a trace of fear in it. Tommy watched, shoulders trembling with emotion. Caleb placed a hand on his arm. "You done something mighty today," he said quietly. "Ain't many men got the courage." Tommy shook his head. "Courage is theirs. They've carried it longer than I ever did." Later that afternoon, a feast was prepared, simple food but shared in joy. Rose cooked like a woman reborn, humming hymns she'd forgotten she knew. When Tommy entered the kitchen, she handed him a plate. "Sit with us," she said. "No tables between master and free folk today." He obeyed, sitting on a bench among them. For a moment, it felt like a new world, one built on laughter, not command. As dusk came, Rose walked with Tommy to the edge of the fields. Fireflies blinked over the cotton like tiny lanterns. "You done more than free bodies," she said softly. "You freed souls." He looked toward the horizon, where the sun dipped low. "Do you think it'll last, Rose? The peace?" She smiled faintly. "Peace don't last by itself. You got to fight to keep it, same as you fought to win it. But the fight's worth it." Thunder rumbled in the distance, a storm gathering far away. Rose's eyes narrowed toward the dark clouds. "You hear that? Trouble comin'. Freedom always calls the storm." Tommy nodded slowly. "Then we'll stand through it together." And as rain began to fall, soft and clean, the two of them stood beneath the oak where chains once hung. The chains were gone now, melted into silence, washed away by mercy. That night, every cabin glowed with candlelight. Voices lifted in song, old spirituals turned to anthems of hope. From the big house, Tommy listened through the open window, tears streaking his face. The farm had been reborn. And though the world beyond the river would soon rage against it, in that single day of 1847, the impossible had become true. The next morning was heavy with the aftermath of celebration. The storm passed quietly overnight, leaving a wet world in its wake, glistening under the pale Sunday. But on Whitfield Farm, the weight of what had been started yesterday still hung in the air, palpable, as if everyone there knew they were standing at the precipice of a new dawn. Even if it was one that would come slowly, Tommy had spent the night in restless sleep, but when he woke, there was no time for lingering. The farm was in upheaval. There were decisions to be made, agreements to be worked out. The work of freedom was harder than the work of slavery, he thought as he pulled on his boots and headed outside. The workers were already in the fields, adjusting to their new roles. They no longer labored under the crack of a whip. Instead, they tended the land as owners of their time, partners in the effort to keep the farm alive. "Mornin', Master Whitfield," Caleb called as he walked alongside Tommy, nodding toward the tobacco rows. "The workers are ready. They're hungry for what comes next. Ain't no fear in them now, just hope." Tommy smiled faintly, a deep ache in his chest. He had done what he could for them, but he knew he couldn't do it all. "They've always been the ones with the strength," he said, "and now they can make their own path. That's what I've given them. But it won't be easy," Caleb added, glancing back over his shoulder as if he could feel the weight of the challenge ahead. "You know that, right?" Tommy didn't answer at first, thinking about the future. He had already sent letters to nearby towns and plantations, informing them of his actions. He expected the worst threats, boycotts, perhaps even violence. The world outside his farm would not take kindly to the idea of slaves becoming free men and women, not without a fight. As they neared the tobacco shed, Tommy paused. Rose was sitting on a bench beneath the old oak tree, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her expression serene but distant. He could tell something had shifted in her, something deeper than the joy she'd shown the day before. "Rose," Tommy called gently. She turned to face him, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, child. Is the farm holding up all right?" "For now," he replied, taking a seat beside her. "But I know we're not done yet. The real work begins today." Rose nodded slowly. "You did a mighty thing yesterday, Tommy, but freedom don't come with no easy roads." She paused, glancing down at her hands, weathered and strong from years of toil. "It's like this garden here, everything's planted, but if you don't tend to it, it'll wither and die." Tommy looked out across the farm. It was quiet today, the usual bustle of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. The change was too fresh, too new for anyone to fully understand. The workers moved more cautiously than they had the day before, still unsure of what their future would hold. "Rose," Tommy began, his voice heavy, "what do we do now? How do we make sure this lasts?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with the wisdom that had been passed down into her over the years, through suffering and survival. "You teach them, Tommy, not just to work the land, but to live as free people. And you protect them from the ones who want to see them fall back into chains." Tommy looked at her, unsure how to start. "I'll speak with them, tell them what's next, what they need to do to survive, but I can't do this alone." "You're not alone, child," she said softly. "You never were." The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and fear. While many of the workers were eager for this new life, the transition wasn't seamless. Some found themselves lost in the vastness of freedom, unsure how to manage their newfound autonomy. Others clung to the ways they'd known, hesitant to leave the old behind. Martha, who had once cooked in the big house, now stood in the kitchen of her own small cabin, stirring a pot of soup. She had chosen to stay, not just because she had nowhere else to go, but because she believed in the dream that Tommy had set in motion. But the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. "I'm glad to be free," she told Rose one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm scared too. I don't know how to live this way, not without someone telling me what to do. I don't know how to keep what I got." Rose sat with her, the weight of her years pressing down on her. "Freedom is a big thing to carry, child, but you carry it better than most. You know how to feed a body. You know how to care for others. That's enough." As the weeks passed, the weight of the outside world's judgment pressed in. Tommy began receiving more letters, some from abolitionists, some from wealthy landowners who wanted to see the success of his experiment. But there were others too, filled with threats, accusations, and warnings. The most unsettling came from a neighbor, a plantation owner named Horace Timmons. "I'm watching you, Whitfield," Timmons had written in a letter that arrived on a cool October morning. "You are no better than the NRS you freed. You will learn, soon enough, that freedom is a privilege one you can't afford." Tommy stood by the window, reading the letter aloud to Rose. She didn't flinch at the words. She'd heard worse in her lifetime. "We're going to have trouble, I can feel it," Tommy muttered, crumpling the letter in his hand. "I reckon you're right," Rose said, standing up from her seat. "But we've already chosen our side, and we can't go back now, can we?" Tommy looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "No," he whispered. "We can't." The farm remained quiet, but the threat loomed, and soon enough, trouble came. A group of men, dressed in the dark attire of plantation enforcers, rode onto the farm one morning, their eyes hard with disdain. "We've come for you, Whitfield," one of them said, his voice cold and menacing. "You can't keep your NRS free, not without paying the price." Tommy stood tall before them, despite the terror that knotted his stomach. "I won't turn back," he said firmly. "You'll have to kill me before I do." The men exchanged glances, but none of them moved. After a long, tense moment, one of the riders spoke again, quieter now. "You're a fool, Whitfield. We'll be back, mark my words." As they left, Rose's voice cut through the silence. "They'll come again. But so long as you stand, so will we." Tommy nodded, resolute in his belief. "Then we fight. We fight for what's right." The farm, built on hope, would not bend to intimidation. They would rebuild, fight, and continue. But they would do it with dignity and with freedom in their hearts. The night air was thick with tension, the farm eerily quiet as the workers settled into their cabins, their faces drawn with concern. Tommy stood in the main house, staring out the window, his hands clasped behind his back, reflecting on what had just occurred. The horsemen had come, their threats clear and chilling, but they hadn't expected the unwavering defiance that Tommy had shown. The problem was, their threats were only the beginning. "I don't like this," Samuel muttered, pacing the room behind Tommy. "You know what they're capable of." Tommy didn't turn to face him. "I do, but we can't back down now. The farm's too important. This experiment, this dream, it's bigger than just us. It's about showing the world what's possible." "But what if it costs you everything?" Samuel asked, his voice strained with worry. Tommy's gaze hardened as he turned to face his friend. "It already has, and I'll keep paying if I have to." Over the next few days, the atmosphere on the farm became even more tense. Word of the confrontation had spread through the local community like wildfire, and Tommy knew the pressure was only going to mount. He couldn't help but feel the weight of every decision he'd made. The lives of everyone here now rested on his shoulders. He had freed his workers, given them wages, and promised them a better life. But the outside world didn't share his vision. And that world was closing in. Martha, who had taken to cooking for the workers in the mornings, came to him one afternoon, her expression somber. "They're talking about us, Tommy. Some folks from around here are saying you're nothing but a troublemaker, trying to ruin the good way of life." Tommy clenched his jaw. "I've heard the same, but if I was going to ruin anything, it would have been slavery itself." Martha's face softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing good, Tommy. Just don't forget about the people standing behind you." "I won't," he replied, looking down at her hand on his shoulder. He didn't need to hear the words to know the support she offered. It wasn't just Martha. There were others: Samuel, Caleb, Rose, people who had risked everything to stay. The next morning, the first signs of resistance began to appear. The tobacco fields were disturbed, crops trampled, plants broken, the soil turned up. It was a message. One of the workers, Caleb, found a piece of cloth pinned to a tree, a crude warning scrawled across it: "Turn back or lose everything." Tommy gathered the workers in the barn that afternoon. There was a storm brewing, both literally and figuratively. The threat of violence, of destruction, was close now, and he could feel it in the air. The farm had been their sanctuary, their symbol of defiance, but it had become a target. "We're not going to back down," Tommy said firmly as the workers gathered. His voice carried authority, but there was a strain in it. "What we've built here isn't just a farm, it's a promise that freedom is real, a promise that we can make it on our own, and we're not going to let anyone take that from us." Rose, standing at the back, nodded in approval. She had lived through so much pain, so much fear, but she was unshakable now. "He's right," she said, her voice strong, her eyes fierce. "They can try to break us, but they won't. We're building something that can't be destroyed." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. The workers looked at each other, some with fear, others with determination. But none of them spoke of leaving, not a single one. Over the next week, the pressure intensified. The acts of sabotage became more frequent: tools stolen, livestock poisoned, even the water supply contaminated. They were trying to break Tommy's resolve, to force him to concede, but he refused to give in. The farm was theirs, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from them. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden hue over the fields, Tommy and Samuel stood on the porch, gazing at the destruction. The barn had been damaged further, windows shattered, the wooden structure scarred by fire. But the workers had been hard at work, repairing the damage, their resolve firm. "It's not going to be easy, Samuel," Tommy said, his voice low but steady. "But we can't let them win. We're doing something good here." "I know," Samuel said, his eyes filled with admiration. "But the cost, Tommy, the cost of it all." Tommy turned to him, his face serious. "The cost of freedom is always high, Samuel, but it's worth it. And if I have to pay every last cent I've got, I will." The next morning, Rose came to him with a different look in her eyes. The usual serenity had been replaced with something sharper concern, perhaps, or fear. "Tommy," she said quietly, "I don't think we can keep rebuilding like this. We need help." Tommy didn't hesitate. He had already written to abolitionist groups in the North, asking for assistance. But it wasn't just money or supplies they needed. They needed more than that: protection, resources, and support. That afternoon, Tommy sent a message to the abolitionist networks, outlining what had happened and how they were being attacked. He didn't ask for much, just enough to keep going. But the message, though filled with urgency, was laced with a call to action. He wasn't asking for charity, he was asking for allies. The response came quicker than Tommy had expected. A group of abolitionists, including some of the freed slaves from nearby towns, arrived at Whitfield Farm in the early hours of the next morning. They brought supplies, but more importantly, they brought something else: hope. They brought reinforcement. One of the men, an abolitionist named Henry, came to Tommy with a serious look on his face. "We've heard what's been going on here. These people don't know what they're up against. You've got a group of farmers here who are ready to fight for what's theirs. We'll stand by you, Tommy. But it's going to take more than just rebuilding barns." Tommy nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. The situation was dire, but with the help of these new allies, maybe they stood a chance. As the days passed, word continued to spread about Tommy's fight for freedom. Some of the neighboring plantation owners began to watch with caution, while others made their intentions clear. The farm was no longer just a farm. It had become a battleground, a symbol of resistance against a system that had held its grip for too long. And as the farm grew stronger, so did the resolve of its workers. The violence, the threats, the sabotage, it had all hardened them. They would not back down. The Whitfield Farm, though scarred, was a testament to the strength of unity, the power of dignity, and the irreplaceable value of freedom. The morning after the arrival of the abolitionist group, the atmosphere on the farm shifted. It wasn't just the presence of the new allies, it was the realization that they were no longer alone in this struggle. Tommy paced in the barn, watching the workers rebuild the damaged structures. They worked with a sense of purpose, but there was something more in the air now, something tangible, like the crackle of electricity before a storm. Tommy had always believed in the power of love and compassion, but now he was starting to see the power of solidarity, the kind that was stronger than anything he had ever imagined. These people, who had once been slaves, were standing together, fighting for something more than just their own lives. They were fighting for freedom, for a future where their children would never know the taste of chains. "How are they holding up?" Samuel asked as he joined Tommy, watching the workers toil away. "Better than I expected," Tommy replied. "They've seen what we can do when we fight back. It's like they've found something in themselves they didn't know was there." Samuel nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's good to see the farm come back to life. I just hope it's enough to send a message." Tommy looked at the workers, each one of them laboring with a determination that mirrored his own. "It has to be," he said. "We're past the point of just surviving. We're here to prove that we can thrive, even in the face of everything they throw at us." The next few days brought with them a sense of growing tension, but also a strange sense of hope. Tommy had sent word to more abolitionist networks, urging them to send reinforcements. He knew that the danger was far from over, but there was something stirring within him, a quiet conviction that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a revolution, one small farm at a time. By the end of the week, word came back that other farmers were watching the situation closely, and some had even begun to consider the possibility of freeing their own slaves. It wasn't a full-scale movement, but it was a start. And in a place as deeply entrenched in the ways of the Old South as Georgia, even a small shift in attitude was a victory. Tommy gathered the workers in the barn once more, his heart pounding in his chest as he prepared to speak. He could feel the weight of his words before they even left his mouth. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about every other enslaved person who had never known freedom, who had never been given the dignity they deserved. "We've shown them we can rebuild," he began, his voice steady, though there was a fire in his eyes. "We've shown them that we can thrive, but we need to do more than just survive. We need to make them understand that we will not be silenced, we will not be broken." The room was quiet, the workers standing in a circle around him, each of them listening intently. Rose, who had been sitting near the back, leaned forward slightly. Her eyes met Tommy's, filled with the same unspoken understanding that had passed between them for years. "You have already done so much, Tommy," she said softly, "but this battle is bigger than all of us. It's not just about saving this farm. It's about changing the world." Tommy nodded, his gaze hardening. "I know, and I'm ready for whatever comes next." The days following the speech were filled with even more intense preparation. Tommy, with the help of the Abolitionist group, began to spread the word further. He wrote letters to other plantation owners, imploring them to reconsider the system they had been born into, to imagine a world where their workers were free to live with dignity. His voice, though quiet at first, was beginning to be heard. The more Tommy worked, the more people listened. In a small-town meeting hall just a few miles away, a group of curious landowners gathered to hear Tommy's message. Some were hesitant, others openly skeptical, but Tommy's passion for the cause was undeniable. He wasn't just speaking about the abstract ideals of abolition, he was speaking from experience. His words rang with the truth of his own journey, and that truth began to resonate with those who had never considered the human cost of their wealth. "It's not about pity," Tommy said during one of his speeches. "It's about respect. It's about recognizing that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the work they can do. It's about building a future where every human being has the chance to live as they were meant to, with dignity, with freedom." As the weeks passed, the pressure continued to build. The neighbors, those who had once watched Tommy's experiment with disdain, now began to speak of him in a different light. Whispers of admiration spread through the community. It was subtle at first, but Tommy could feel the shift. It was like the wind had changed direction, and for the first time, there was a real chance that things could change. But there was also the threat of violence. The Committee of Southern Values had not given up on their mission to destroy Tommy's farm, and they were growing desperate. One night, just as the moon hung high in the sky, a group of men masked and armed approached the farm, intent on sending a message. Tommy wasn't in the house when they arrived. He was out in the fields, checking on the crops with Samuel and a few of the workers. But he knew what would happen. He'd been expecting it. It wasn't just about threats anymore. It was about intimidation, about trying to crush the hope that had been growing on the farm. The men lit torches, and the smoke began to rise in the distance. The barn was burning, the flames licking the sky. But this time, the workers didn't scatter. They stood together, ready to fight for what they had. Tommy's heart raced as he ran back toward the farm, but as he approached the barn, he could see something he hadn't expected. The workers, led by Rose and Samuel, had already begun to fight back. They weren't running, they were defending what was theirs. "We can't let them do this," Rose said, her voice fierce as she held a bucket of water in her hands, throwing it onto the flames. "This is our home, Tommy, and we'll fight for it until the end." Tommy stood tall, his hand gripping the fence post beside him. He had never been prouder in his life. This was the turning point, the moment he knew, without a doubt, that they could win this fight. The morning after the fire, the farm was eerily quiet. The barn, once a symbol of their hard work and hope, had been reduced to smoldering ruins. But what was left in its wake wasn't just destruction, it was determination. The workers had gathered in the fields, not with sorrow or defeat, but with renewed resolve. They had faced down their enemies before, but this time felt different. The attacks were no longer random acts of violence, they were a declaration of war. Tommy stood at the edge of the fields, watching the smoke rise in the distance. He could hear the faint sounds of the workers in the distance, their voices rising in unison as they made plans to rebuild. It was a moment he would never forget, a moment when the idea of freedom and dignity had become something far more precious than just an ideal. "Tommy, we can't let this stand," Samuel said, approaching him slowly, his voice low but firm. "They're trying to break us. They want us to quit, to go back to the way things were." Tommy's eyes narrowed as he looked toward the horizon. "I know, but they'll never break us. Not now. Not after everything we've been through. We're fighting for something much bigger than this farm, Samuel. We're fighting for a future where none of us are ever enslaved again." Samuel nodded, a determined look on his face. "Then let's make sure they know it. Let's show them that we won't back down." The workers rallied together, gathering tools, supplies, and whatever materials they could salvage from the ruins. It was no longer just about rebuilding the barn, it was about rebuilding their spirits, their resolve. They had been threatened, attacked, and oppressed for too long, but now they would make sure their voices were heard. Over the next few days, the farm transformed. What had once been a place of fear and uncertainty was becoming a symbol of resilience and hope. Word had spread throughout the region about the attack, and soon more allies began to arrive. Some came from nearby towns, others from faraway cities where the abolitionist movement had begun to gather strength. They were farmers, activists, and former slaves who had heard about the farm and wanted to lend their support. With every new arrival, the strength of Tommy's cause grew. By the end of the week, the barn had been rebuilt, stronger than ever. It stood not just as a shelter for the workers and their tools, but as a testament to their commitment to the cause. As Tommy stood in front of the newly rebuilt barn, he felt a surge of pride. They had faced their enemies, and they had prevailed. The battle was far from over, but they had proven that they could withstand anything thrown their way. Tommy looked around at the people who had made this possible, the workers who had chosen freedom over safety, the allies who had come from far and wide to offer their help. This was more than a fight for a farm. This was a fight for the future, for the idea that human dignity could never be bought or sold. "You did it, Tommy," Rose said, her voice filled with emotion as she joined him by the barn. "You've given us a place where we can live free. You've shown us that freedom isn't just a word, it's a way of life." Tommy smiled, but there was a bitter sweetness to his expression. "We're not finished yet, Rose. We've won a battle, but the war is far from over. There's still so much work to be done." Rose placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll keep fighting as long as we have to. We'll fight for this farm, and for every person who deserves to live free." As the weeks passed, the farm became a symbol of defiance against the oppressive forces that had once held sway over the South. Tommy's experiment in freedom and equality had inspired countless others, and his name was being spoken of with both admiration and fear. More plantation owners were beginning to question the system they had once upheld without question. Some were even reaching out to Tommy for advice, seeking a way to free their slaves and follow in his footsteps. But the opposition was relentless. The pro-slavery committee that had once plotted in the shadows now began to move with more force, calling for boycotts, organizing protests, and seeking legal means to stop Tommy's experiment. They knew that if Tommy's success continued, it would signal the end of the system they had built their entire lives around. For them, this was a matter of survival. Tommy knew that the stakes had grown higher and that the attacks would only become more severe, but he wasn't backing down. "We've come too far to turn back now," he said one night as he addressed his workers. "We've fought for freedom, for dignity, and we'll keep fighting until every last person who needs help gets it." The workers, once slaves, now free men and women, stood tall around him. Their faces were filled with determination. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they had already come so far together. They had endured the worst the world could throw at them, and they were still standing. As the autumn months wore on, Tommy's resolve was tested like never before. The legal pressures were mounting. The southern states, fearful of the ripple effect that Tommy's success might have, began to pass laws designed to stifle his movement. New restrictions were placed on the freeing of slaves, and laws were being drafted that would make it almost impossible for anyone to follow in Tommy's footsteps. But Tommy was undeterred. "They can pass all the laws they want," he said, pacing in the parlor of his house one evening, "but they can't change what's in our hearts. They can't take away our dignity. They can't take away our freedom." His words resonated with everyone in the room, but Tommy knew that the fight was far from over. His enemies were powerful, and they were willing to do whatever it took to preserve the system of slavery. But Tommy was ready for the battle. And this time, he wasn't alone. With the winter approaching, the pressure mounted. A final showdown seemed inevitable. The question was no longer whether they would win, it was how long they could hold out. But Tommy's heart remained steadfast. "We've already won," he said one day as he stood with Rose, looking out over the fields that they had fought so hard to protect. "The world has seen what we're capable of, and that's a victory no one can take away." As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Tommy knew that the future was still uncertain. But whatever came next, he was prepared, because in his heart, he knew that the fight for freedom was a fight worth dying for. The winter months passed slowly, each day weighed down by uncertainty. Tommy's farm had become a beacon of hope in a world consumed by fear and division, but it was also the target of relentless opposition. The local pro-slavery forces, now organized into a more formal group, began to step up their efforts. They had already tried to destroy Tommy's farm physically, but now they were aiming to tear it down legally, socially, and economically. Tommy stood on the porch one morning, staring out at the fields blanketed in snow. He could see the faint tracks of workers trudging through the snow, continuing their daily tasks, despite the biting cold. There was no sign of weakness in their movements, only a quiet determination. But Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much harder. "Tommy, you've got to know that this isn't just about us anymore," Rose said, joining him on the porch. Her frailty had become more apparent in recent weeks, but her eyes still held the fire they had always possessed. "This is a movement. People are watching us. You're leading a revolution." Tommy turned to face her, his gaze thoughtful. "A revolution, maybe, but one I never wanted to lead. I just wanted to give people a chance to live as human beings. And you've done that," Rose said, her voice soft but firm. "But sometimes, doing what's right comes with a price." The weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. He had known, deep down, that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond the farm. He had known that freedom was never truly free. But now, as the pressures mounted, Tommy began to understand just how much it would cost. The first blow came in the form of a legal challenge. A group of local landowners filed a lawsuit against Tommy, claiming that his actions were unlawful and that he had violated several state and federal statutes. They argued that by freeing his slaves and paying them wages, he had undermined the entire social and economic structure of the South. They demanded that Tommy be forced to return his workers to slavery and that he compensate them for the alleged damages they had caused to the community's economy. The lawsuit, though expected, hit Tommy hard. The legal battle was expensive, and it drained the farm's resources. Tommy had already been struggling financially after the attacks on the farm, and now this. It seemed as though every time they rebuilt, something else came along to tear them down. But Tommy didn't back down. "This is our fight," he said to Rose one evening, his voice resolute. "If I lose this case, it'll set us back decades, but I'm not going to let them win." As the legal battle dragged on, the personal cost of Tommy's experiment became increasingly apparent. The workers, once enthusiastic about the prospect of freedom, began to feel the strain. They were working harder than ever, not just to maintain the farm, but to keep the dream of freedom alive. They were well aware of the dangers that loomed over them. Each day brought new threats, both direct and indirect. Martha, the cook, had been particularly affected. She had stayed on the farm when many others had left, believing in Tommy's vision and his commitment to freedom. But the constant attacks, the uncertainty, and the mounting pressure were beginning to wear on her. "Master Tommy," she said one morning, as she worked in the kitchen, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I want to believe in what we're doing here, but I see the strain it's putting on you and on all of us." Tommy paused, wiping the sweat from his brow as he sat down at the table. "I know, Martha. It's hard. I didn't expect this to be easy, but I won't give up, not now. I can't. I've already come too far." Martha nodded, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I understand, Master Tommy, but I also know that it's not just about the farm anymore. It's about something bigger, but can we survive it? I don't know." The turning point came when the legal challenge reached its climax. The case went to court, and the trial became a public spectacle. Pro-slavery groups from all over the South rallied behind the landowners, pouring money and resources into the legal battle. On the other side, Tommy had only a handful of supporters: abolitionists, sympathetic neighbors, and a few former slaves who had become advocates for the cause. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Tommy sat at the defense table, his face a mask of determination. Rose sat beside him, her hand in his, offering him the silent strength she had always provided. The prosecution argued that Tommy's actions had disrupted the established order, that his farm had become a dangerous precedent that could inspire other plantation owners to follow his example. They spoke of the chaos that would ensue if slavery were to be abolished, of the economic devastation that would follow the loss of slave labor. But Tommy's lawyer, an abolitionist from Boston, stood firm in his defense. "What Mr. Whitfield has done is not only legal but just," he argued. "He has given his workers something that no law or institution could ever take away: their humanity." The trial lasted for weeks, with arguments coming from both sides that grew more impassioned with every passing day. And as the days wore on, Tommy felt the weight of the fight pressing down on him. His health had begun to deteriorate under the stress, and he found himself questioning whether it was worth it, whether the dream of a free South, of a country that respected human dignity above all else, was even achievable. Finally, the verdict came down. The judge, a former slave owner himself, ruled in favor of Tommy. The case was dismissed, and Tommy's right to free his workers and pay them wages was upheld. The news spread like wildfire, and the abolitionist community celebrated the victory. But Tommy knew that the battle was far from over. This victory was just one small step in a much larger war. "I've won," Tommy said quietly to Rose later that evening, "but it's come at a cost. My health, my money, and the lives of everyone on this farm. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Rose looked at him with love and understanding. "You've already done more than anyone ever thought possible. You've shown the world that freedom is worth fighting for. And that's a lesson that will live on long after we're both gone." As the winter passed and the legal battle came to an end, Tommy's health continued to decline. The toll of the years, the stress, and the sacrifices he had made for the cause were beginning to take their toll. But even in the face of his own mortality, Tommy refused to give up on the dream he had worked so hard to build. "I won't rest until every person who wants to be free is free," he said one evening as he sat by the fire with Rose. "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us." Rose smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "And that's why you'll always be remembered, because you showed us what it means to truly be free." As spring arrived in 1855, the air was thick with anticipation. Tommy's farm, once a symbol of defiance and courage, had now become something more: a living testament to the ideals of freedom, dignity, and humanity. News of his victory in the courtroom had spread far and wide, but the true impact of his actions had yet to fully unfold. Tommy's experiment had captured the attention of abolitionists, activists, and even those who had been on the fence about slavery, but it had also drawn the ire of those who sought to protect the established order at all costs. Despite the pressure from his neighbors and the constant threats of violence, Tommy's resolve never wavered. He believed, more than ever, that the system of slavery was not just morally wrong, but also economically unsound. The success of his farm, where former slaves now worked for wages and had a stake in the profits, proved that a different way of life was not only possible, but preferable. Still, Tommy knew that the battle was far from over. The forces against him were strong, and they would stop at nothing to crush his experiment. One afternoon, as Tommy and Rose sat on the porch, watching the workers tend to the fields, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. It was Samuel, Tommy's trusted overseer, who had become a close friend and ally. He had been with Tommy from the beginning, a former slave who had chosen to stay on the farm after he was freed, and now he was one of the most vocal supporters of the experiment. "Master Tommy," Samuel called as he approached, his face grim, "we've got word from Charleston. There's talk of a new law being passed, one that would make it illegal to hire former slaves or to give them wages. If it goes through, it could end everything we've worked for." Tommy stood up, his expression hardening. "A law like that would take away everything we've fought for," he said quietly. "But we won't go down without a fight." The proposed law sent shockwaves through the abolitionist community. Tommy received letters of support from across the North, including from influential figures like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. They urged him to stand firm and to continue his work, but there was a growing sense of urgency in their words. If the law passed, it could set a precedent that would roll back the progress made in the fight for freedom. Tommy's legal battle was far from over. As his lawyers prepared to challenge the new law in court, the situation on the ground grew more dangerous. Pro-slavery groups intensified their efforts, and the threats against Tommy and his workers became more violent. Vandalism and intimidation were common, but now there were whispers of something worse: open acts of violence. Despite this, Tommy remained focused on the task at hand. He refused to let fear dictate his actions. He knew that if he gave in now, if he allowed the forces of oppression to win, it would be a betrayal of everything he had worked for. everything he had sacrificed. "We'll stand strong, just like we've always done," Tommy said to his workers one evening as they gathered around the fire after a long day's work. "Our fight isn't just for freedom, it's for justice, and we won't let anyone take that from us." The tension in the air was palpable as the trial to challenge the new law began. Tommy, accompanied by his lawyer, stood before the court once again, facing down the forces that sought to destroy everything he had built. The prosecution argued that the economic impact of allowing former slaves to work for wages would destabilize the South, and that it would set a dangerous precedent that could lead to the abolition of slavery altogether. But Tommy's defense was clear and unwavering. "This is not just about economics," he said in his closing statement. "It's about humanity. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity of every person, regardless of their race. What we have built here is proof that we can live together, not as master and slave, but as equals. If the law allows us to be free, then it should allow us to work and live with dignity. That is the true meaning of freedom." The courtroom fell silent as Tommy finished speaking. There was a quiet but growing sense of hope in the air, but also a deep understanding that the outcome of this case would shape the future of the country. In the weeks that followed, Tommy's farm continued to operate, despite the increasing threats and challenges. The workers, more determined than ever, continued to toil in the fields, producing crops that were more bountiful and of higher quality than they had ever been under the brutal system of slavery. But the fear of what might happen loomed over them all, a constant reminder of the fragility of their newfound freedom. Rose, whose health had continued to decline, spent her days watching over the farm, offering guidance and wisdom to those who needed it most. Despite her age and illness, she never stopped fighting for what she believed in. She had lived a life that had been defined by hardship, but now, in her final years, she was able to see the fruits of her labor, the seeds of freedom that had been planted so many years ago. One evening, as Tommy sat beside her in the fading light of the setting sun, Rose looked up at him with a smile. "You've done it, Tommy. You've made a difference." Tommy's eyes softened as he gazed at her. "We've done it, Mama Rose. You taught me everything I know about love and dignity. Without you, none of this would have been possible." Rose's smile grew wider, and her hand squeezed his. "You've always been the one to make it happen. You've changed the world, and there's no turning back now." As summer approached, the court case reached its conclusion. The judge, after much deliberation, ruled in favor of Tommy and his workers, declaring that the proposed law was unconstitutional and that Tommy's actions were not only legal but morally right. The decision sent shockwaves through the South, and for the first time, it seemed that the tide was beginning to turn. Tommy's victory was celebrated by abolitionists and free blacks alike, but it was also a victory for the countless others who had struggled for freedom in the face of oppression. Tommy's farm, once a symbol of rebellion, had now become a symbol of hope, a beacon of what was possible when people dared to stand up for what was right. But the victory was bittersweet. Rose, who had been the heart and soul of the farm, passed away just days after the ruling. She had lived long enough to see the dream she had nurtured take root, but her body could no longer keep up with the demands of life. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the love she had given and received throughout her life. The funeral for Rose was unlike any other in rural Georgia. The service was attended by people from all walks of life: former slaves, abolitionists, neighbors, and even some of Tommy's former adversaries. It was a celebration of a life well lived, a life that had touched so many and inspired so much. Tommy stood at the grave, his heart heavy with loss but full of gratitude. "You've given me everything, Mama Rose. Your love, your wisdom, and your strength. I promise I'll continue the fight. I'll keep your legacy alive." The months following Rose's death were a time of transformation for Tommy. Though he had always been driven by a sense of duty to his workers, his mother's passing deepened his resolve. It was as though the loss of the woman who had shaped him into the man he had become ignited a fire within him, one that burned with a fierceness and clarity that nothing could extinguish. Rose had taught him the true meaning of family, not the kind bound by blood, but the kind created by shared love, sacrifice, and respect. It was a lesson that Tommy held close to his heart, and as the years went by, it became the foundation for everything he did. He knew that his fight for freedom was far from over, But now it was not just for his workers or for the community they had built together, it was for her. Every step he took, every victory he won, was a tribute to the woman who had given him everything. The Rose Washington Institute for Freedom, which Tommy had established on the farm in his mother's honor, became a beacon of hope for countless individuals seeking to build new lives. The school, initially a modest endeavor to provide former slaves with the education they had been denied, quickly grew into one of the most important institutions in the South. In its early days, the institute offered basic literacy classes, but Tommy's vision was far broader. He believed that true freedom could only be achieved through education, and so he expanded the curriculum to include practical skills, farming techniques, carpentry, blacksmithing, and even business management. He was determined to provide his students with the tools they needed to succeed in the world, to give them not just freedom, but the opportunity to thrive. As the school grew, so did Tommy's reputation. Abolitionists from all corners of the country came to visit the institute, marveling at the success of his experiment and taking inspiration from his work. His example was a living testament to the fact that freedom and dignity were not just ideals, they were achievable realities, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. But not everyone was thrilled with Tommy's success. Pro-slavery groups, emboldened by the growing resistance to their way of life, began to escalate their efforts. Vandalism and intimidation, which had been a constant threat, became more violent. Masked men burned down one of the institute's buildings, and a series of brutal attacks on Tommy's workers followed. Tommy was no stranger to adversity, but the attacks shook him to his core. The people he had worked so hard to protect were being targeted, and he could no longer stand by idly. He knew that, in order to protect the future of the institute and the people who had placed their trust in him, he had to take more drastic action. One evening, after the latest round of violence, Tommy stood in the middle of the farm, his jaw clenched and his eyes burning with determination. Samuel approached, his face a mix of concern and admiration. "Master Tommy," Samuel said softly, "what will we do? The attacks are only going to get worse." Tommy turned to face him, a fire in his eyes. "We will not back down," he said firmly. "This farm, this institute, they represent something greater than any of us. If they think they can intimidate us, they are sorely mistaken. We will rebuild, and we will continue to fight for what is right." The following months were a blur of work, legal battles, and tense negotiations. Tommy's legal team was busy challenging the new laws being passed by pro-slavery legislators, while also trying to secure funding to rebuild the institute. The community rallied behind Tommy, contributing money, supplies, and labor to help restore what had been lost in the attacks. Tommy's farm became a symbol of resilience, proof that love, courage, and unity could overcome even the most formidable of obstacles. But Tommy was not content to simply defend what he had. He was determined to press forward, to continue expanding the institute, and to spread the message of freedom far and wide. In addition to his educational work, he became a vocal advocate for the abolition of slavery. He traveled across the North, speaking at rallies and meetings, encouraging others to follow his example. His message was simple. Freedom was not just a legal right, it was a human right, and every person had the right to live with dignity. Though the battle was far from over, there was a growing sense of momentum behind Tommy's cause. The news of his efforts spread, and more plantation owners began to question the system they had built their lives upon. Some, inspired by Tommy's example, even began to consider the possibility of freeing their slaves, but not all were swayed. Pro-slavery groups, furious at Tommy's success, doubled down on their efforts to discredit and destroy him. They spread lies and rumors, accusing him of being a traitor to his race and his heritage. They organized boycotts of his farm and worked to undermine his credibility in every way possible. Yet, for every setback, Tommy's supporters grew stronger. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, Tommy had become one of the most well-known figures in the abolitionist movement. His institute had produced hundreds of graduates, many of whom went on to become leaders in their communities, doctors, teachers, business owners, and political activists. His farm had become a thriving, self-sustaining model of what a world without slavery could look like. When the war began, Tommy did not hesitate. He enlisted as a colonel in the Union Army, leading a regiment made up of former slaves who had fought for their freedom. Tommy's men were some of the most courageous and dedicated soldiers in the war, and they fought with a fervor that was unmatched. They knew they were not just fighting for the Union, they were fighting for the very ideals that had shaped their lives. Tommy carried Rose's photograph with him into battle, a constant reminder of the woman who had inspired him and taught him everything he knew about love, sacrifice, and humanity. His men, too, carried the memory of the woman who had helped them find their dignity and worth. Together, they fought not just for victory, but for the future of a nation that had yet to fully embrace the ideals of freedom and equality. In the years following the war, Tommy's Institute continued to thrive. It grew into a full college, offering higher education to former slaves and their children. The school became a model for similar institutions across the South, and Tommy's influence reached far beyond the confines of Georgia. His vision of a world where all people were treated with dignity and respect had inspired a generation, and it was a vision that continued to shape the future of the country. Tommy never married, dedicating his life to the cause of freedom and education. His legacy lived on in the thousands of students who graduated from his college, many of whom went on to play crucial roles in the development of the African American community. As Tommy aged, the weight of the years began to show on him. His hair, once dark and full, had turned a silvery gray, and his shoulders, which had once stood so tall and strong, now stooped slightly under the burden of decades of tireless work. Yet, his resolve had never been stronger. His commitment to the cause of freedom had only deepened with time. He was now an old man, but his heart was still a warrior's, driven by a mission that would outlive him. In the early days of the new century, a new wave of hostility swept through the South, fueled by the old fears of change and the bitter resentment of those who had lost power with the defeat of the Confederacy. Segregationist policies began to take root, and there were growing efforts to undo the progress that had been made during Reconstruction. The winds of change were being pushed back by the weight of tradition and prejudice. Tommy was not blind to the growing threats. He had seen the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. He had watched as the government turned a blind eye to the continued violence and injustice being perpetrated against African Americans. But even in the face of these dark clouds, Tommy remained unshaken. He refused to let fear dictate the future. The Rose Washington Institute had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where students could find not only an education but also a sense of pride and dignity in a world that was often hostile to them. Yet, even as the institute flourished, Tommy knew that the path forward would not be without peril. He had been fighting for a vision of freedom for so long, and now he feared that his work would be in vain. There were too many who were still willing to turn back the clock, to undo the progress that had been made. One evening, as the sun began to set over the tobacco fields, Tommy sat on the porch of his home, deep in thought. The soft chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wind in the trees were the only sounds that filled the air. He was alone, but not for long. Samuel, now an old man himself, walked up the steps and sat beside Tommy, a knowing look in his eyes. "Master Tommy," Samuel said gently, "you've built something that will never be destroyed. It's bigger than us, bigger than anything we've fought for. You've given people like me a chance at life, a chance to live with dignity." Tommy looked at Samuel, his weathered face a mix of gratitude and weariness. "I know, Samuel, but I fear that the world is changing. There are forces at work that want to undo everything we've built. We've come so far, but I can't help but wonder if it's all just a fleeting moment in time, a dream that's too good to last." Samuel's eyes were filled with understanding. He had seen the struggle, the sacrifices, and the battles fought by Tommy and his people, but he also knew that Tommy's legacy was something that couldn't be erased. It was rooted in the hearts of those who had been touched by his work. "Maybe it will be hard," Samuel said, "but we've faced worse. We've faced the burning barns, the attacks, the threats, and we're still here. The world may change, but what you've given us can't be taken away. It's in us, and that's something no one can ever steal." Tommy smiled, though the weight of his years was apparent in the deep lines around his eyes. "I hope you're right, Samuel. I hope we've laid down a foundation strong enough to weather whatever comes next, but I fear the fight isn't over. I fear that the battle for freedom will continue long after I'm gone." As the years passed, Tommy's health began to deteriorate. His body, worn down by decades of hard work and sacrifice, could no longer keep up with the demands he had placed on it, but his mind remained sharp, his spirit unwavering. He continued to speak out against injustice, to fight for the cause of freedom, even as his body grew weaker. His voice, though frail, still carried the strength of a lifetime of conviction. One day, as Tommy sat in his study, surrounded by letters from former students and colleagues, a visitor arrived, a young journalist from the north, eager to write a story about the man who had inspired so many. The journalist was struck by the power of Tommy's words, the passion that still burned in him despite his age. "Colonel Whitfield," the journalist said, "your life's work is an inspiration to so many. But I must ask you, what do you see for the future? Do you think the world is changing for the better?" Tommy leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he thought about the question. He had seen so much in his lifetime, the horrors of slavery, the brutality of war, the triumphs and defeats of the struggle for freedom. Yet, he remained hopeful. Not because the world was perfect, but because he believed in the power of individuals to make a difference. "I see a future where people are free," Tommy said slowly, "not just in name, but in spirit. A world where every person, regardless of the color of their skin, is treated with dignity and respect. The world may be divided, but I believe that love is stronger than hate. The work we've done here, the lives we've touched, it's not just about me. It's about all of us. And as long as we keep fighting, we can change the world." The final years of Tommy's life were marked by a quiet determination. His health continued to decline, but his legacy only grew stronger. The Rose Washington Institute had become a thriving institution, producing generations of educated, empowered individuals who went on to become leaders, activists, and advocates for justice. When Tommy died in 1903, at the age of 84, his passing was mourned by thousands. His funeral was attended by former students, colleagues, and friends, as well as members of the community who had witnessed the transformative power of his work. His death was a loss not only to those who had known him personally, but to the cause of freedom that he had devoted his life to. Tommy's last words, according to those who were present, were simple but profound. "Tell Mama Rose I kept my promise. Tell her I never stopped fighting for what she taught me was right." And in that moment, it was clear that the fight was far from over. Tommy Whitfield may have passed from this world, but his legacy lived on. The work he had started, his unwavering belief in the dignity and worth of every human being, would continue to inspire generations to come. The story of Rose Washington and Tommy Whitfield, the unlikely mother and son, had become more than just a tale of individual triumph. It was a story that had changed the course of history, a story of love that had transcended the boundaries of law, race, and time. And as the sun set on the fields where Tommy had once worked, the legacy of his courage, compassion, and vision for a better world stood firm, an everlasting flame that would never be extinguished.